The gun was already pressed against Roy Shelby's temple when Edna Barrett threw herself through the saloon doors and screamed his name. Everything inside the Devil's Gulch saloon went silent. The piano player's fingers froze above the keys. Whiskey glasses hung in the air, mid-pour. 30 pairs of eyes snapped to the woman standing in the doorway, her dark hair loose and wild from riding hard, her chest heaving, her green eyes fixed on the man kneeling in the sawdust with a pistol kissing the side of his skull. "Let him go, Harlan." Her voice did not shake. That was the most terrifying thing about it. Harlan Voss, rancher predator, the man who owned half of Dry Creek, Texas, smiled at her from behind Roy's shoulder. He was a big man, thick through the chest, with a mustache that curled like a snake around his upper lip. The smile never reached his pale eyes. "Miss Barrett," Harlan said pleasantly, "you rode awful fast to watch a man die." "He's not going to die." She took one step inside, the floorboards groaned. "Because you're going to hear what I have to say first." Roy's jaw was tight. There was blood on his lip, fresh and dark, and his hands were bound behind his back with rough rope. His brown eyes found hers across the smoky room, and what she saw in them cracked something open in her chest. Not fear, no, Roy Shelby was not a man who feared easily. What she saw was guilt, raw, aching, desperate guilt, like a man who believed he deserved what was happening to him. That look alone told her everything she needed to know about how wrong she had been. "Edna," his voice was gravel and smoke, "get out of here." "No," she said simply. Harlan cocked the hammer. The sound filled the room like a thunderclap. "You've got 30 seconds to say something interesting," Harlan told her. "Then I finish this and I go back to my drink." Edna Barrett had never been a woman who played cards, but she reached into the pocket of her riding coat, pulled out a folded letter sealed with a federal marshal's stamp, and held it up so every man in the room could see it. "That's 29 seconds more than I need," she said. She had not always been this brave. 3 months ago, she had arrived in Dry Creek, Texas, with 2 carpet bags, a letter of introduction from a church in Cincinnati, and a heart that had been broken so thoroughly she believed it could never be put back together. She had come to start over. She had come to disappear into the hard, honest work of the frontier, to become someone quiet and useful and unremarkable. She had not planned on Roy Shelby. It was the spring of 1881, and the cattle town of Dry Creek sat like a stubborn weed at the edge of the Edwards Plateau, the kind of place the railroad had not yet reached, and God seemed to visit only occasionally. The main street ran exactly 400 yards from the livery stable to the undertaker's office, which the locals seemed to find grimly appropriate. There was a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a church made of limestone, 2 competing barbershops, and the Devil's Gulch saloon, which did more business than every other establishment combined. Edna had stepped off the stagecoach on a Tuesday afternoon in March, squinting into a wind that carried red dust and the smell of cattle and something else she couldn't name then, something wild and open and terrifyingly free. She was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate from the Cincinnati Normal School, and she had answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette seeking a schoolteacher for the children of Dry Creek, Texas. Salary $22 per month, housing provided. The housing turned out to be a single room behind the church, barely large enough for a cot, a washstand, and a small iron stove. The schoolroom was 1 building over, a low-ceilinged limestone box with 12 mismatched desks and a chalkboard that had seen better decades. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 5 to 14, and every single one of them was testing her before she had even set her bag down. She had loved it immediately. She had not expected to love the work. She had taken the position out of necessity, out of the need to be somewhere new, somewhere the name of the man who had left her at the altar in Cincinnati would not follow her like a shadow. But standing in front of those rough-edged, sun-browned children, spelling out letters on the chalkboard while they watched her with those enormous, curious eyes, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Useful, wanted, real. She met Roy Shelby on her 5th day in Dry Creek. He came to the schoolhouse not as a parent, he had no children, but as a man who had promised to fix the broken step on the front porch that had nearly snapped her ankle on her second morning. He arrived just after school let out, when she was still at the chalkboard, erasing the day's arithmetic problems. She heard the hammer strikes before she saw him, the confident, rhythmic sound of a man who knew what he was doing with his hands. She stepped outside and found him crouched on the porch, a box of nails beside him, prying up the old rotten board with practiced efficiency. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been worked on by weather and time into something honest and spare. There was a long scar along his left jaw she would later learn was from a barbed wire fence, not a knife fight, though the story of the knife fight was better, and he told it sometimes. He looked up when her shadow fell across him and said, "You must be the new schoolteacher." "You must be the man fixing my porch," she replied. He smiled at that. It was a slow smile, cautious at the edges, like a man who had learned not to spend smiles too freely. "Roy Shelby. I do some work for the town when they need it. Board asked me to come out." "Edna Barrett," she said. "Thank you. I nearly went through that step yesterday." "Saw the crack when I walked by Tuesday," he said. "Should have come sooner." There was something in the way he said that, a quiet self-reproach, like a man who held himself accountable for things that were not entirely his responsibility, that made her look at him more carefully. He noticed her looking and turned back to his work. She went inside and made coffee on the small iron stove, and when the step was fixed, she brought him a cup. He sat on the newly repaired porch, and she sat in the doorway, and they talked for 20 minutes about things that did not matter: the weather, the dust, the best road into town from the south, while the sky went amber behind the limestone ridge to the west. When he left, he tipped his hat without quite meeting her eyes, and she went inside and stood at the window watching him walk away and felt, for the first time in months, that she was somewhere she might actually want to stay. She did not let herself think about that feeling too hard. She had thought about feelings too hard before, and it had cost her. His name had been Gerald Marsh. He had been a banker's son in Cincinnati, educated and charming, and exactly the kind of man her mother had told her to find. They had courted for 14 months. He had proposed with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. He had kissed her in the garden of his family's house on a Sunday evening in June, and told her she was the only thing he was certain of in an uncertain world. He had not shown up to the church on their wedding day. He had, instead, sent a note delivered by his younger brother, which explained in careful, bloodless language that he had realized he was not ready for the responsibilities of marriage, that he hoped she would forgive him, and that he wished her every happiness in her future endeavors. Every happiness in her future endeavors. She had read those words in the vestibule of the church while wearing her mother's altered wedding gown, surrounded by flowers she had chosen herself, while the organist played quietly in the next room, and her maid of honor held her hand and did not know what to say. She had not cried until she was home, alone, with the door locked. She did not intend to make that mistake again. She did not intend to trust the feeling that came over her when Roy Shelby smiled at her with that careful, cautious smile. She was in Dry Creek to teach and to rebuild, not to open herself up to the specific kind of catastrophe that came with caring about someone. But the frontier had its own ideas about plans. Roy began appearing with a comfortable regularity that was impossible not to notice and increasingly difficult to resent. He repaired the loose shutter on the schoolroom window. He showed her where the best water pump in town was, the one that didn't seize up in cold mornings. He left a cord of wood stacked outside her back door one morning without telling her he'd done it, and she only knew it was him because she'd seen nobody else. When she asked him about it directly, he looked faintly embarrassed and said the nights were still cold for March. She caught herself thinking about him at inconvenient moments, when she was grading spelling tests, when she was heating water for washing, when she was lying in her narrow cot listening to the coyotes carry on in the darkness beyond town. What she did not know, what nobody had told her, because in small towns some information moved fast and other information was kept like a stone at the bottom of a well, was that Roy Shelby had a history in Dry Creek that complicated everything. She learned it in pieces. The first piece came from Clara Hennessy, wife of the postmaster, who stopped her outside the general store one morning in early April to admire her bonnet, and then, within 60 seconds, mentioned casually that Roy Shelby was a man with a dark past. She said it with the particular enjoyment of someone delivering both a warning and a gift. "He killed a man," Clara said, lowering her voice to the sacred pitch of valuable gossip. "3 years ago, down in Del Rio. They say it was self-defense, but the man he killed had a brother, and that brother is Harlan Voss." Edna looked at her steadily. "Was it self-defense?" Clara blinked. Apparently the question of whether it was actually self-defense was less interesting than the fact that it had happened at all. "Well, some say so. Roy says so. But Harlan Voss says different, and Harlan Voss owns a great deal of land and a great deal of loyalty in this county, so—" She trailed off meaningfully. Edna thanked her for the conversation and walked away, and stood outside the schoolhouse that afternoon while her students were at recess, turning what she had been told over in her mind like a stone in her hand, examining it from every angle. She did not ask Roy about it. Not yet. It did not feel like her right yet, this thing that lived in his past. The second piece came from a man named Pete Calloway, who ran the livery stable, and was one of those men who filled silence with words like a man caulking gaps. Compulsively, constantly, without much regard for whether the gaps needed filling. He told her, while she was arranging for a horse for a weekend ride, that Roy Shelby had come to Dry Creek 2 years ago with nothing but a bedroll and a reputation that could have hung a less resilient man. That he'd worked himself into a position of grudging respect through sheer stubbornness. That he'd hired on at a small ranch east of town, and then, when the owner died with no heirs, had managed to purchase the rights to the land through a bank loan and 3 years of impossible work. "Man owns 40 acres now," Pete said, not without admiration. "Built the house himself. Does odd jobs for the town between cattle season. Keeps to himself mostly." He paused. "Harlan Voss has been wanting that land for 2 years. Offered to buy it twice. Roy said no both times. There are men who'd say that's brave, and men who'd say that's the most dangerous kind of stupid." She understood then that the situation was more complicated than the story of a killing. There was land in it, and money, and the particular brand of power that men like Harlan Voss accumulated in places where the law was thin and slow. She found herself wanting, fiercely and inexplicably, for Roy to be safe. She saw him that same evening. He was in the hardware store when she passed, and he stepped outside just as she was walking by, and they almost collided on the boardwalk. He caught her arm to steady her, and for a moment they were very close together in the slanted evening light, his hand on her arm, his face just above hers, and the warmth of his presence was something she felt in her sternum. "Sorry," he said, stepping back immediately, releasing her arm. "Didn't see you." "My fault," she said. "I was thinking." "Dangerous habit in this town," he said. "Too many loose boards." She laughed. It came out genuine and unguarded, the way laughter only does when you're not thinking about how you look when you do it. Something crossed his face when she laughed, something quick and wondering, like a man who has glimpsed something he did not expect to find. "Would you walk with me?" she asked, surprising herself. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." They walked the length of the main street and back as the sun finished setting, talking about his land. He described it with a quiet pride he seemed almost shy about, the way a man speaks of something he loves but hasn't yet decided he deserves. 40 acres of good grass and a creek that didn't dry up even in August. A house he'd built himself with limestone from the ridge, 1 room at first, then 2. A small herd of cattle he was slowly building up. "It's not much yet," he said. "It sounds like everything," she replied, and she meant it simply, not as flattery, and he heard the sincerity in it and seemed to not know quite what to do with it. When they reached the corner where she would turn toward the church and her small room, she stopped and looked at him directly. "Roy," she said, "I've heard some things about you, about Del Rio." His face went very still, not closed exactly. More like a man who has been expecting a particular piece of weather and has finally seen it on the horizon. "I expect you have," he said carefully. "I'm not asking for an explanation," she said. "I don't think it's my right yet. I'm just telling you I've heard it, and I want you to know that I haven't decided anything about you based on other people's versions of your life." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the street, lifting a little dust. Above them, the stars were beginning to appear in enormous numbers, the way they do in Texas where the sky has room to mean it. "Why not?" he asked finally. His voice was rough at the edges. "Because I know what it's like," she said carefully, "to have people decide things about you based on a version of your story they heard secondhand." She did not explain further. She said good night. She walked to her door and let herself in and sat down on the edge of her cot and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed slowly until her heart stopped behaving like a runaway horse. She was in serious trouble. The month of April in Dry Creek was the kind of April that seemed designed to make people fall in love with the landscape, which was, she suspected, the landscape's way of making them overlook its worst qualities. Wildflowers came up through the red dust, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and things she didn't know the names of yet. And the wind was warm instead of cutting, and the evenings stretched long and gold over the plateau. Roy began finding reasons to be near the schoolhouse when school let out. He was never obvious about it. He was not a man who seemed comfortable being obvious about anything, but she started recognizing his habits. He would be at the water pump at 4 o'clock, when the children spilled out into the afternoon. He would be on the main street at 4:30, which was when she usually went to the general store or the post office. He would appear at the church steps on Sunday mornings just as services were letting out. She found herself arranging her own schedule around these accidental meetings in ways she refused to consciously acknowledge. They talked about everything. She told him about Cincinnati, the smell of the river in summer, the grand houses on the good streets, the grinding formality of a life lived in a certain class's expectations. She did not tell him about Gerald Marsh. Not yet. But she told him that she had come to Dry Creek because she needed to be somewhere that had no memory of who she had been before. He told her about growing up in Abilene, the son of a man who could ride anything with 4 legs and charm anyone in a room, and who had died of a fever when Roy was 16, leaving him to figure out the world with nothing but the skills his father had taught him, and a stubbornness he had apparently been born with. He told her about the years of ranch work up and down the cattle country, always someone else's cattle, someone else's land, someone else's life. He told her about the day he had first seen the 40 acres east of Dry Creek and known, with the certainty of instinct rather than reason, that it was where he meant to stop. He told her about Del Rio on a Tuesday evening in late April, when they were sitting on the limestone steps behind the church watching the darkness come in from the east. He did not preamble it or build to it. He simply said, "I want to tell you what happened in Del Rio." She said, "All right." His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man who has rehearsed something not to make it sound better, but to make sure he doesn't leave anything out. Cal Voss had come into the saloon where Roy was eating supper, already drunk, looking for a fight with the specific mechanical determination of men who have decided the evening requires one. He had fixed on Roy because Roy was alone and had a horse worth stealing, and because Roy had, earlier in the day, refused to join the outfit Cal was recruiting for a cattle rustling operation that would have paid well and required setting aside every scruple Roy owned. Cal had gone for his gun first. Roy had been faster. 1 shot. Cal Voss had died before the doctor arrived. The marshal in Del Rio had ruled it self-defense. There had been witnesses. Roy had not been charged. He had, however, understood that the geography between himself and Harlan Voss's grief and fury needed to expand significantly, And so he had come north and eventually found Dry Creek and found his 40 acres. When he finished, there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Edna sat with the story, feeling its weight, its texture, the particular quality of sadness that attached to a man who had done a thing he had been justified in doing and still carried it. "Do you wish it had gone differently?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "Even though I'd likely be dead if it had." He paused. "That's not a comfortable thing to hold." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She reached over in the darkness and put her hand over his where it rested on the step between them. He went very still, the way a man goes still when something he was not expecting happens, and he is afraid that moving will make it stop. They stayed like that for a long time, while the stars came out in force above the Edwards Plateau, and neither of them said anything more, and it was the most honest conversation Edna Barrett had had in years. Harlan Voss came to Dry Creek for the first time in mid-May. He came with 4 men, riders who had the look of men paid specifically for their presence rather than any particular skill, which in Edna's limited but rapidly expanding education in the frontier meant they were hired muscle. Harlan himself was everything she had imagined from the descriptions. Large, deliberate, the kind of man who moves through space as if the space is already his. He set himself up at the Devil's Gulch Saloon, and within 48 hours had made his purposes clear. He wanted Roy's 40 acres. He had found legal language, or a lawyer willing to manufacture it, suggesting that the original deed of sale had been improperly registered and might be contestable. It was thin ice and everybody could see it, but thin ice is sometimes enough if you're a large man with 4 armed riders and the patience to wait for the thaw. Roy came to the schoolhouse that evening looking like a man carrying something extremely heavy without letting it show. He told her what Harlan had said. He told her about the deed challenge. He told her he had sent a letter to the land office in Austin asking for confirmation of the registration. "He's trying to frighten you," she said. "He's doing a reasonable job of it," Roy admitted, which she respected greatly. His willingness to say that out loud rather than perform a courage he wasn't entirely feeling. "What do you need?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment as if the question surprised him. "I don't know that there's anything to be done right now except wait." "Then we wait," she said. The "we" was not accidental, and he heard it, and something in his face changed, a softening, a loosening, like a fist slowly opening. He did not kiss her that night, but he wanted to, and she knew it, and she wanted him to, and he knew that. They were both being very careful with each other in the way people are careful when they understand that what is between them is fragile and real and worth not rushing. May moved into June, and the heat came down on Dry Creek like a judgment. The school session ended for the summer, which freed Edna's afternoons, which meant she spent more of them with Roy riding out to his property on the horse she had been borrowing from Pete Calloway's stable, walking the fence lines he was mending, sitting in the shade of the single live oak near the creek while he talked about what the place would look like in 5 years, 10 years. She understood that he was inviting her into a vision, not just describing a ranch. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in June beside that creek, when she had said something funny about a jackrabbit that had startled her horse, and he had laughed, really laughed, unguarded and free. And then the laughter had faded and they were very close together, and he had looked at her with those steady brown eyes and asked, very quietly, "May I?" And she had said yes before he finished the sentence. It was a careful kiss, deliberate. The kind of kiss that is also a question, and the answer she gave it, her hands coming up to hold his face, tilting into him, was not careful at all, and she felt him exhale against her, a long, slow breath like a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "Edna," he said. "I know," she said. She did know. She knew that this was not a light thing, that she was not a woman who kissed men beside creek beds carelessly, that whatever had been building between them since that first afternoon on the repaired porch had become something that would require courage to sustain. She was also aware, in a way she had not allowed herself to be in Cincinnati, that the courage was already there. She could feel it. She told him about Gerald Marsh a week later. She had intended to keep it as the kind of past that stays in its box, but one evening they were sitting on the porch of his limestone house. Both rooms finished now, a third one framed but not yet roofed, and he was telling her something about the future in that careful, cautious way of his. And she suddenly understood that he was holding back a part of it because he was afraid of asking too much, of assuming too much, of making the same mistake she had once experienced from the other direction. She told him everything: the courtship, the proposal, the wedding dress, the note delivered by the younger brother. She told him in a flat, factual voice because that was the only way she knew to say it without it undoing her. When she finished, he was very quiet. He was a coward, he said finally, not with anger, with the calm certainty of a verdict. Yes, she said, but I think I was also not brave enough to see what I was choosing. You were 24 years old and someone you trusted lied to you, Roy said. That's not a failure of your vision, that's a failure of his character. She felt the truth of it land somewhere it hadn't been able to land before. She had been telling herself versions of the story where she bore responsibility for not seeing it coming, for trusting too easily, for wanting too much. Roy's version was simpler and kinder and possibly more accurate. I'm not Gerald Marsh, he said. He said it looking directly at her with the particular gravity of a man making a promise he intends to keep. I'm not going to tell you what I feel and then vanish. I don't know how to do that. I know, she said. She did know. She had known it for weeks. Roy Shelby was a man constitutionally incapable of pretense. It was, she thought, possibly his finest quality. She reached for his hand. He held it with the same careful certainty he applied to everything. The trouble with Harlan Voss accelerated in July. The letter from the land office in Austin came back confirming that Roy's deed was properly registered and legally sound. Roy sent a copy to the county courthouse and had it filed. This should have ended the matter. It did not, because Harlan Voss was not primarily interested in the legal status of the deed. He was interested in the land, and in making Roy's life in Dry Creek uncomfortable enough that selling would seem like the easier choice. Small things at first. Roy's fence on the north boundary was cut in 3 places over the course of 2 weeks. He found one of his cattle dead near the water source. No obvious cause, no marks from a predator. 2 of the men who sometimes worked for him by the day stopped being available, without explanation. Roy reported each incident to the county sheriff, a methodical man named Darnell Graves who rode out from the county seat every 2 weeks and who took notes conscientiously and did very little. Sheriff Graves was not corrupt, exactly. He was simply a man acutely aware of how much land and how many voters Harlan Voss controlled in this county, and that awareness produced a particular kind of practical paralysis. Edna watched Roy navigate this with a controlled frustration that he kept largely private. He repaired the fences. He moved his remaining cattle to better pasture. He filed each incident report with Graves with the patience of a man who understands that records matter even when they don't immediately change things. What she was less aware of was that Harlan Voss had also taken an interest in her, not in any directly threatening way, but in the way powerful men in small places take note of anyone who might be leverage. She found this out when one of Harlan's riders came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning. School would start again in September, but she was there preparing and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, looking politely menacing, to deliver a message. Mr. Voss wanted to invite Miss Barrett to dinner at the hotel that evening, purely a social occasion. He wished to make the acquaintance of the town's new teacher. She looked at the man for a moment. "Tell Mr. Voss I'm busy this evening," she said pleasantly, "and every other evening." The man went away. She stood at the chalkboard for several minutes afterward, pressing her chalk between her palms, and then she went to find Roy. He was at the hardware store. She told him about the invitation. She watched something move through his face, alarm, anger, and then a controlled settling back toward calm, the way a river settles after a stone has been thrown in. "He's trying to use you," Roy said. "Whether to provoke me or to find information or something else, he's trying to use you." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to let him." "Edna." He looked at her with an expression she had begun to learn, the one he wore when he was about to say something he believed she might not want to hear. "I need you to understand that being near me right now carries real risk. Harlan is not a man who stops." "I'm aware of that," she said. "Are you trying to send me away from you?" "No," the word was immediate and absolute. "No, I am not. I'm telling you the truth about what's happening and letting you decide what you want to do with it." "Then here is what I want to do with it," she said. "I want to help you find a way to stop this, not wait for it to stop on its own and not leave. Help." He studied her for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" She was thinking about the letter she had drafted the previous week and not yet sent. She was thinking about a contact she had in Cincinnati, a man who had been a friend of her father's, now a federal circuit judge, and whether his jurisdiction extended to matters in Texas. She was thinking about the fact that patterns of intimidation, property damage, and legal harassment, when properly documented and presented to the right authority, sometimes met with a different response than a county sheriff could provide. "I'm thinking," she said, "that we need to go above the county level." It took 6 weeks of careful work. She wrote letters to the federal court in San Antonio, to the Land Commission, to a U.S. Marshal named Henry Beaumont, who had jurisdiction over exactly the kind of property intimidation campaign that Harlan Voss was running. She was methodical and specific, including dates, the copies of the incident reports Roy had filed with Graves, and her own witnessing of the harassment. Roy was simultaneously continuing his normal operations with a determined consistency that she admired. He would not be run off his land by anyone's hired disruption, and every morning he was out working it, feeding his cattle, mending what was broken, building what was not yet finished. They had fallen into a rhythm that was not yet officially anything but had the texture of a life shared. She rode out to the property 3 or 4 afternoons a week. He came into town for church on Sundays and walked her home after. They ate supper together at the hotel dining room on Friday evenings, which the town had noticed and discussed and eventually accepted as simply a fact about Dry Creek, the way one accepts the particular shape of a landmark. In August, he asked her if she had ever considered staying in Dry Creek permanently. They were sitting on the porch of the limestone house in the long summer evening, the cattle quiet in the near pasture, the creek audible in the distance. He asked it carefully, the way he asked everything important, without ornamentation or manipulation. Just the question, clean and honest. "I've considered it," she said, and she looked at him for a moment. "Ask me a more specific question," she said softly. He turned to face her fully. In the evening light he was all shadow and warm color, his eyes very direct. "Would you consider staying here with me, not as the schoolteacher?" As he paused, even Roy Shelby, who was not a man given to stumbling, stumbled here, and she found it unbearably moving. "As the woman I intend to marry, if she'll have me." She had imagined, during the dark months after Cincinnati, that a proposal of marriage would always feel like standing at the edge of something that might collapse under her. She had imagined it would feel like risk and exposure and the particular terror of trusting someone with the thing you most needed to protect. Instead, it felt like coming in from a long ride into somewhere warm and solid. "Yes," she said. "Roy, yes." He took her hands in both of his, and there was the smile, that slow, cautious smile, except that this time it was not cautious at all. It was full and open and bright, and she thought she had never seen anyone look so thoroughly, completely glad. He kissed her then, in the long summer evening on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and neither of them thought about Gerald Marsh or Harlan Voss or anything that lived in the past or threatened in the present. They were entirely present, entirely themselves, entirely sure. The response from U.S. Marshal Henry Beaumont arrived at the post office in Dry Creek on a Monday morning in late August, 3 days before Harlan Voss made his most dangerous move. The letter confirmed that Marshal Beaumont's office had received her documentation, found it compelling, and was initiating an investigation into Harlan Voss for a pattern of property intimidation, deed fraud attempts, and coercion. He expected to have a federal warrant within the week. He asked her to hold the original documents safe and to be in contact. She read the letter standing at the post office counter with her heart hammering, and then she walked directly to Roy's property to tell him. He read it twice, then he folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and breathed. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she corrected. "Edna," he looked up at her. The expression on his face was something she could not precisely name: gratitude and awe and something deeper. The look of a man who has been fighting alone for a long time and has suddenly, startlingly, found that he is not. "Stop looking at me like that," she said, because if he kept looking at her like that she was going to cry, and she had done quite enough crying in her life and intended to be judicious about future occurrences. "I'm going to look at you exactly like this for the rest of my life," he said, "and there is nothing you can do about it." She laughed, and he kissed her, and the letter from Marshal Beaumont was pressed carefully between the pages of her writing ledger. Harlan Voss, apparently sensing that his window was closing, acted 3 days later. He had been in Dry Creek for a week by that point, having arrived with his riders again, this time with a new lawyer in tow, a man from San Antonio with a nervous mouth and very expensive boots. They had been making the rounds of the courthouse and the sheriff's office, apparently attempting to accelerate whatever legal challenge they still believed they could mount. On a Wednesday evening, 2 of Harlan's riders went to Roy's property and ran his small herd of cattle through a section of fencing they had cut, scattering the animals across 3 miles of terrain. Roy had been in town when it happened. When Pete Calloway's boy rode to find him with the news, Roy had gone immediately to the sheriff's office to report it and to leave a message that he would be unavailable until his cattle were found. Harlan's men had anticipated this. While Roy was at the sheriff's office, 2 other riders had come to his property and left it burning. Not the whole property. The barn, the first structure he had built on the land, the one that predated even the house, the one he had built in 3 weeks the first summer with nothing but determination and lumber from the mill in the next county. Roy arrived back at his property to find the barn reduced to a shell of smoldering timber. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he had gone, apparently, not back to town, but to the Devil's Gulch saloon, because he had known without needing to be told that Harlan Voss would be there, comfortable and satisfied, waiting to be confronted, and to use that confrontation for whatever purpose he had planned. Which was how Roy Shelby ended up on his knees in the sawdust of the Devil's Gulch with a gun against his temple. Harlan had not expected the confrontation to go the way it did. He had expected Roy to come in swinging, to give him a justification. Roy had come in very quietly and very deliberately, and told Harlan Voss, in a voice that filled the room, that the barn fire had been witnessed. A rider passing on the North Road had seen the men and their horses and would testify to it, and the federal marshal's office was already involved, and Harlan was looking at federal charges for a pattern of crimes that spanned 2 counties. Harlan had produced his gun then, because he was a man who reacted to loss of control by reaching for the most immediate instrument of it. And then Edna Barrett had come through the doors. She held up the letter from Marshal Beaumont. "This is a letter of Federal Investigation Authority naming Harlan Voss as the subject of an active inquiry by the United States Marshal's Office in San Antonio," she said. Her voice was clear and steady and reached every corner of the room. "The warrant is already issued. Marshal Beaumont arrives in Dry Creek tomorrow morning on the early stage. Anyone in this room who is found to be in the company of Harlan Voss when that stage arrives may be considered an accessory to federal charges." She looked around the room. Several of Harlan's riders had gone very still. The lawyer with the expensive boots had turned the color of old chalk. "That gun against Roy Shelby's head," she continued, "is assault with a deadly weapon. If Roy Shelby is harmed in any way tonight, that is attempted murder. Federal charges, Mr. Voss, not county. Federal." Harlan Voss stared at her. The room was absolutely silent. Slowly, with the measured movements of a man who is very angry but not stupid, Harlan Voss lowered the gun. Roy was on his feet before the hammer was fully uncocked. He moved away from Harlan with the quick, controlled efficiency of a man who has been in physical danger before and knows how to exit it. He crossed the room to where Edna was standing and took her arm and turned her toward the door, and the crowd parted for them without anyone quite deciding to, and they walked out of the Devil's Gulch saloon together into the warm Texas night. On the boardwalk outside, Roy turned to look at her. He had blood on his lip and sawdust on his knees, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just saved his life, which was essentially what had happened. "Where did you get the letter?" he said. "From my writing ledger," she said. "Where I've been keeping it. I brought it because I thought it might be needed." "How did you know where I was?" "Clara Hennessy told me she'd seen you riding toward the saloon with that particular look on your face." He absorbed this. "And you rode here alone." "I have a horse," she said. He made a sound that was half laugh and half something that was not entirely composed. He pulled her toward him and held her against his chest with both arms, and she felt his heart hammering through his shirt, and she held him back with equal force, and neither of them said anything for a long time while Dry Creek went about its evening around them. U.S. Marshal Henry Beaumont arrived on the morning stage the next day at 7:15, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals and a substantial collection of paperwork. He was a compact, serious man with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who has spent years sorting truth from narrative. Harlan Voss and his men were still in the hotel. The lawyer had apparently attempted to leave on horseback at midnight and had been quietly intercepted by a deputy who had ridden ahead the previous evening. The legal proceedings that followed were not quick. Nothing involving federal warrants and land rights and criminal charges in 1881 Texas was quick, but they were thorough. Harlan Voss was taken into federal custody on charges that included criminal intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit deed fraud. The riders who had burned the barn were identified. The passing witness came forward with his account, and by the end of a week of testimony and documentation, the case against Harlan Voss was considerably stronger than his lawyers would have preferred. Roy's deed was formally confirmed by the Land Commission without any remaining challenge. His 40 acres were unambiguously, entirely, legally his. The barn was gone, but the land was his. He stood on his property on the evening after the federal proceedings concluded, Edna beside him, looking at the rectangle of black ash where the barn had stood. The house was untouched. The cattle had been recovered, most of them, all but 2. The creek ran on, indifferent and reliable. "I'll rebuild it," he said. There was no defeat in his voice, only the calm practicality of a man who has been rebuilding things his whole life. "We'll rebuild it," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You know anything about barn construction?" "I know how to hand someone nails," she said. "I've been told that's a start." He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side, and she leaned into him, and they stood together looking at the blackened ground while the evening came in warm and soft across the plateau, and the cattle made their quiet sounds in the pasture, and the creek said its constant thing over its stones. They were married in October. The ceremony was held in the limestone church on a Saturday, which was the only day the circuit preacher came through, and it was, by the standards of frontier weddings, quite an event. Clara Hennessy organized things with the particular efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for an excuse to organize things. The schoolchildren, whom Edna had come to love with the fierce, specific tenderness of a teacher who means it, decorated the church with wildflowers they had pressed through the summer and kept specifically for this purpose. a piece of planning and sweetness that made her eyes sting when she saw it. Roy stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, clearly purchased and pressed within the last week, and he watched her walk down the aisle with an expression so openly, unguardedly joyful that Pete Calloway, who was standing in the third row, had to look away on the grounds that it was almost too much to witness directly. Edna wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, deep blue, not white, which she had decided was exactly right for a woman who was not beginning but continuing, who was not uncertain but sure. Her hair was up, with wildflowers she had put in herself, and she carried no bouquet because her hands were needed. She had told Clara, for shaking hands afterward, and she didn't want to be burdened. When she reached Roy and they were facing each other, she saw that his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the candlelight. The preacher said the words. They said theirs. When Roy slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band, which he had purchased from the jeweler in the next county and driven 2 hours to collect, his hands were completely steady, and she loved him specifically for that steadiness, which was one of the truest things about him. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher said. Roy kissed her with the same deliberate care he applied to everything he meant, and the church broke into applause that had the particular enthusiasm of a small town that has been watching something happen and is tremendously glad it has finally officially happened. The reception was in the street outside, tables set up with food contributed by what appeared to be every woman in Dry Creek, a fiddle player who knew a great many songs, and enough general goodwill to sustain a larger gathering. They danced, which surprised Edna because she had not known Roy danced, and it should not have surprised her because he did everything with the same controlled competence, but she laughed when he took her hand and led her into the center of the cleared space. "You didn't tell me you could dance," she said. "You didn't ask," he said, spinning her out and back with a precision that made the fiddle player grin. The celebrations went on until well past dark, when Dry Creek's collective sense of propriety and the cold of the October night finally drove people home. Roy and Edna drove out to the property in the wagon, just the two of them, and the sound of the horses' hooves on the dry road and the enormous Texas sky overhead. The house he had built was warm, a fire already laid in the hearth by Pete Calloway, who had gone ahead specifically for this purpose, and then made himself scarce. The 2 rooms were modest and solid and smelled of limestone and wood smoke. She stood in the main room looking around at it, the table he had built, the shelves he had put up, the hooks by the door, and felt the profound, specific satisfaction of being somewhere she had chosen to be. Roy came to stand behind her. He put his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back against him. "Mrs. Shelby," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, and she turned around and looked at him. "Yes, I am." The winter that followed was hard in the way Texas winters were sometimes hard, not cold enough for proper snow but gray and damp and relentless in the wind, and it was the happiest winter Edna Barrett Shelby could remember. She had the schoolchildren back from September, and teaching them through the fall and winter was its own particular joy, the gradual unfolding of literacy and understanding in small persons who were working hard at it. Roy rebuilt the barn. He started in November with timber he had arranged for through the mill, and he worked on it every day the weather permitted. And on weekends, Edna was there beside him doing exactly what she had promised, handing nails, holding boards, learning more about construction than she had ever expected to know. 3 of the men from town came out on 2 separate Saturdays to help with the heavy framing, which Roy accepted with the somewhat grudging gratitude of a self-sufficient man learning to let people assist him. By December, the barn was finished. It was better than the original, larger, with better ventilation and a proper hayloft. Roy stood inside it on the day it was done, looking up at the rafters, and she stood beside him and could see that he was making peace with something, settling the loss of the old one by acknowledging the existence of this new one. "Better than the first?" she asked. "Better than the first," he confirmed. She had written to her mother in Cincinnati in November, a long letter explaining everything: the town, the work, Roy, the marriage. Her mother's reply arrived in January and was characteristically her mother. Concerned about the frontier, uncertain about the marriage, and ultimately supportive in the way of a woman who has raised a daughter with a strong character and has learned to trust that character even when it leads somewhere unexpected. She sent a wedding gift of a set of china dishes that took 6 weeks to arrive, packed in straw and arrived completely intact, which Roy received with the appropriate seriousness due. A set of dishes that had traveled from Cincinnati, Ohio, to Dry Creek, Texas. Edna wrote back with more detail, describing Roy so precisely and honestly that by the third exchange her mother's letters were asking specific questions about him: what he was building, how the cattle were doing, whether the roof of the house was properly sealed against the rain, which was the closest her mother came to saying she was glad. Harlan Voss's case worked through the federal courts slowly and without any theatrical developments. The charges related to the barn fire were the most solid, given the eyewitness testimony. The fraud charges were more complicated, but the documentation Edna had assembled proved its worth. By the following spring, Harlan Voss had entered an agreement with the federal prosecutor that involved a substantial fine, the formal withdrawal of all claims against Roy's property, and a period of federal supervision. He did not go to prison, which was the particular justice of 1881 Texas, but he lost his leverage and his standing in the county diminished considerably, which was in some ways more meaningful to him. His riders dispersed. The lawyer with the expensive boots went back to San Antonio. The threat that had sat over Roy Shelby's land like a low cloud for years simply, slowly, lifted. Roy received the official confirmation from the federal court on a Friday in April. He read the letter at the kitchen table while Edna was making coffee, and then he set it down and said nothing for a moment. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he confirmed. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table, and they looked at each other in the morning light coming through the window she had hung curtains on in January, and she thought that this ordinary morning, this coffee, this man across from her with the confirmation letter, and the look of a man who has been holding his breath for 3 years and has finally exhaled, was precisely what she had come to Dry Creek to find, even though she had not known it. He reached across the table and took her hand. He did it simply, without ceremony, the way you take the hand of someone who has been beside you through things that tested you both. "Thank you," he said. He meant it for everything. She understood that. "You would have found a way through it without me," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not as well and not as gladly." She smiled at him. He smiled back, that full, open smile that she had been watching slowly become his natural state, the caution at its edges softening month by month as he became a man who believed he was allowed to be happy. Spring came back to Dry Creek with the bluebonnets and the long golden evenings, and with it came news that was new and private and enormous. She told Roy on a Tuesday evening in May, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most things, directly, honestly, without performance. She had been certain for 3 weeks before she said it, because she was a woman who preferred to be sure before she spoke. He went very still in the particular way he went still when something reached him at the deepest level. Then he stood up from the porch steps and looked at her, and she could see that he was doing what Roy Shelby did with large emotions, holding them carefully, weighing them, making sure he had them properly before he let them show. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He sat back down next to her this time instead of across, and put his arm around her and pulled her against his side and pressed his lips to her temple and said against her hair very quietly, "I did not think I would have this." "I know," she said. "I didn't think I deserved it," he admitted. "You do," she said firmly. "Roy, you do." He held her tighter. She felt him breathe. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she considered a mercy. The frontier was not an easy place to be carrying a child, the distances from medical help, the physical demands of daily life, the general absence of the comforts and knowledge her mother would have brought to bear in Cincinnati. But Edna was healthy and practical, and Dry Creek had a doctor, a young man named Samuel Hart who had come out from Dallas 2 years previous, and she made regular use of him, and Roy became, quietly and without comment, the most attentive person she had ever shared a living space with. He was not loud about it. He did not fuss or hover. But he noticed everything: that she was tired in the afternoons in July, and so ensured that there was always a reason for her to be inside and resting, that the water pump was stiff in the morning and difficult to work, and so he fixed it, that the walk to the schoolhouse became harder in August as the summer heat compounded everything, and so he drove her in the wagon on the days she asked, without requiring her to ask more than once. She loved him for the small things, she thought, as much as for the large. Their son was born in December, in the limestone house on the 40 acres, attended by Dr. Hart and Clara Hennessy, who had appointed herself indispensable to the process, with a determination that brooked no argument. It was a long labor, 14 hours, and Edna was exhausted and fierce through the whole of it, which Roy, who sat outside the door for the full 14 hours and drove Clara to the edge of her patience by asking questions every 30 minutes, appreciated without being entirely able to articulate. When Dr. Hart opened the door and told Roy it was done and his wife was fine and he had a son, Roy sat down where he was standing, right there in the hallway, and put his face in his hands for a moment that he would later describe as necessary, and that Edna would describe as the most charming thing she had ever witnessed. Then he went in to meet his family. She was sitting up in bed with the baby, and she looked tired and proud and absolutely herself, and Roy sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the tiny, red-faced, extremely opinionated-looking infant in her arms, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when something reached him too deeply for his habitual composure to contain it. It simply opened up, unguarded and luminous. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly, as if not to startle him. The baby was not startled. The baby was, in fact, asleep. "He's perfect," Roy said. "He's very small," Edna said. "He'll grow," Roy said, which was exactly the kind of reasonable, practical observation that made her love him unreasonably. They named him James Thomas Shelby, James for Roy's father, Thomas for Edna's, which seemed right. A child who carried both of them before he was a week old. Word spread through Dry Creek with the speed of small-town news, and by the second day there was a procession of visitors arriving with food and good wishes that lasted for a week and was coordinated primarily by Clara Hennessy, who had by this point accepted her role in the Shelby household as informal community liaison and had no intention of relinquishing it. The schoolchildren sent a card they had made themselves, signed by every one of them, illustrated with drawings that included what was apparently meant to be Roy on horseback, several cattle, and Edna at her chalkboard, all rendered with the specific artistic confidence of children who are working from conviction if not precision. Edna kept it for the rest of her life. The winter was quiet and domestic and full. Roy had hired 2 permanent hands for the ranch, by this point young brothers named Antonio and Luis Fuentes, who had come up from Laredo and who were, as Pete Calloway had assessed them during their first week, the most competent ranch hands in this county, and possibly the next 3 over. Antonio and Luis managed the daily operations through the winter with a reliable expertise that freed Roy for the building and expanding that was always his occupation in the cold months. He was working on a 3rd room by January, a proper room for James, though James was currently residing in a cradle in the main room and would not need his own space for a considerable time. Roy built it anyway, with the patient foresight of a man who understood that children, given time, grow into their rooms. Edna returned to teaching in January, bringing James with her to the schoolhouse in the mornings, which the children received with approximately the same enthusiasm as a holiday. James, at 6 weeks old, was utterly indifferent to his celebrity, but showed an early aptitude for sleeping through arithmetic lessons, which his mother considered a character flaw and his father considered perfectly reasonable. The spring of 1883 brought changes to Dry Creek. The railroad surveyors came through in February, walking the land south of town and taking measurements, which set off weeks of speculation and excitement and argument in every establishment in town. By April, it was confirmed. A spur line would run through Dry Creek within 2 years. The implications for the cattle trade were significant, and Roy spent several evenings at the kitchen table with a map and Antonio Fuentes working out what it would mean for their operation, where they would need to expand, what the increased access to market would make possible. Edna sat at the other end of the table writing lesson plans and listening to them talk, offering occasional observations about the mathematics of the calculations that were occasionally resented and always correct. Roy had stopped being surprised by her practicality long ago and had moved directly to relying on it. By summer, Roy had negotiated to purchase an additional 20 acres on the east boundary, not from Harlan Voss or anyone connected to him, but from a farmer moving his family to California who needed the sale price for the journey. 60 acres now, a proper herd, the barn that Roy had rebuilt better than the original, the house that had grown into 4 rooms and a proper kitchen. Antonio and Louis with their small bunkhouse added to the northeast of the main house. Edna stood on the porch one July evening, James on her hip, watching Roy come in from the east pasture with the kind of straight-backed, unhurried walk of a man who is where he belongs. The late sun was warm on the limestone walls of the house, and the creek was audible, and the cattle were quiet, and everything around her had the weight and texture of something real. Roy came through the gate and across the yard and up the porch steps, and he kissed her and James in that order, which James tolerated with the equanimity of a child who had been doing this since before he could object. And then Roy leaned against the porch post and looked out at the land in the evening and was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About whether this is actually my life," he said. He said it with a wondering quality, not a questioning one. "It is," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I'm having trouble sometimes believing it's not a thing I'm going to wake up from." She shifted James to her other hip and looked at Roy. "You built it," she said. "Every piece of it. The barn, the house, the fence lines, the herd. You built all of it. This is not luck. This is what you made." "We made," he said. "We made," she agreed. He put his arm around her, careful of James, who was developing a strong opinion about being jostled, and they stood on the porch of the house they had made in the long July evening, and she thought that the particular peace she felt in that moment was not the absence of difficulty. There would always be difficulty, fence lines to mend and weather to manage and the general relentlessness of the life, but the presence of something solid enough to rest against. Roy was that. This place was that. This life that she had come to accidentally and found to be entirely intentional. She was 30 years old. She had been in Dry Creek for 2 years. She had a husband who looked at her with an attention and a tenderness that still, sometimes, caught her off guard. She had a son who had his father's eyes and her own stubbornness, and was currently attempting to eat the hem of her sleeve. She had 14 schoolchildren who were learning to read and write and reason in ways that would carry them forward into a world that was changing very quickly. And she cared about that work with an investment that had not diminished at all. She had her letters to and from her mother, which had grown warmer and more specific over 2 years, as her mother's uncertainty had slowly been replaced by something that resembled genuine curiosity about this life her daughter had chosen. Her mother was planning a visit in the fall, a journey Edna was simultaneously looking forward to and approaching with the caution of a woman who knows how her mother will react to the particular rustic quality of frontier life. "Your mother," Roy said, as if reading her thought. "I was thinking about that," she admitted. "She'll survive it," he said. "She will," Edna agreed. "She'll have notes afterward." "I'll put my best board back on the porch," Roy offered solemnly. She laughed, and James looked up at the sound of it with the expression babies wear when they have not yet decided whether a loud thing is alarming or interesting. And Roy looked at her laughing, and wore the expression she had first seen on the evening they walked the main street together, that quick and wondering look, except that it was no longer quick or wondering. It had settled into something permanent and certain, the expression of a man who has found the thing he did not entirely believe existed and intends to keep it safe. The fall brought Roy's mother's arrival. She came by the same route Edna had taken, the stage from San Antonio, the bump and roll of the road into Dry Creek, and she stepped off on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the town, and then at her daughter, and then at Roy Shelby, who was standing quietly beside his wife with James on his arm, and the look on Roy's face was the polite, steady look he wore in all uncertain social situations. Edna's mother was a small, upright woman named Margaret Barrett who had spent 50 years developing a precise understanding of people and was not shy about applying it. She looked at Roy for a long moment. Roy met the look without flinching. "You built the house," she said to him. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She nodded once as if a preliminary determination had been reached. "Show me." He did. He walked her through every room, answering her questions about construction and materials with the same patient specificity he brought to everything. When she examined the kitchen and the stove and the shelves he had built, she ran her hand along the wood and looked at the joinery and nodded again. She spent 10 days. She held James with the particular expertise of a grandmother who has been waiting. She ate at the kitchen table with them in the evenings, and asked Roy specific questions about the cattle operation and the land and the railroad spur, and listened to his answers with genuine attention. And she sat with Edna on the porch in the afternoons, while Roy was working, and did not say what Edna had been somewhat bracing for her to say. On her last evening, when Roy had gone out to check on the cattle, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with coffee, Margaret Barrett looked at her daughter and said, "He is exactly what he appears to be." "Yes," Edna said, "he is." "That is rarer than people say," her mother said. "I know," Edna said. "You were right to come here," her mother said. "I was not certain of that before, I am certain of it now." Edna felt the last small knot of something, the residual need for external confirmation of a choice she had already fully made, simply dissolve. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," her mother said, with the brisk tone she used to redirect sentiment. "Help me finish this coffee. The cold out here is something I was not adequately prepared for." Margaret Barrett left the next morning on the early stage, with a promise to return in the spring, and Edna stood at the edge of the road watching the stage roll away and felt the particular clean sadness of a good parting, the kind that is about love rather than loss. Roy came to stand beside her. James was in his arms, watching the departing stage with the philosophical interest of a 1-year-old confronting the concept of travel. "She approved," Roy said. "It was not quite a question." "She did," Edna said. He exhaled. "I was somewhat concerned." "I know you were," she said. "You were very composed about it." "I tried to be," he said. She leaned up and kissed his cheek, and he turned and smiled at her, that full, open smile, and James, who had strong opinions about being ignored during demonstrations of parental affection, said something emphatic in the wordless language of 11-month-olds. "He agrees," Edna said. "He usually does," Roy said. The railroad spur arrived in 1884, as promised, cutting through the south side of Dry Creek with a noise and a disruption, and an eventual settling that changed the town in ways both immediately obvious and slowly unfurling. The cattle trade accelerated. New businesses opened on the main street. Families arrived that had not been there before. The population of Dry Creek grew from 300 and some to nearly 500 by the end of the year, which meant more children at the school, which meant Edna spent the summer of 1884 writing letters to the school board about needing a second room and an assistant teacher, letters which were eventually successful, and which she considered one of her significant professional victories. Roy's operation grew with the railroad access. He was able to move his cattle to market at prices that had been previously unavailable, and the difference in revenue allowed him to hire a third hand, a quiet, capable man named George Pratt who had come west from Tennessee, and who, within 6 months, had proven himself as reliable as Antonio and Lewis. Roy held his 60 acres and managed them with the focused competence of a man who has had a vision of what a thing could be and is methodically making it that. Antonio Fuentes, who had been with them for 2 years by this point, fell into the habit of eating Sunday supper with Roy and Edna when no other obligations kept him, and these suppers had become something Roy and Edna valued. Antonio was intelligent and funny, with opinions about everything from cattle breeding to politics that were worth hearing and arguing with, and James was developing a clear and early adoration of Antonio that Edna found entirely reasonable. She was pregnant again by the fall of 1884, which she announced to Roy with the same direct practicality as the first time. His response, this time, was faster. He did not need the moment of stillness that he had needed before. He simply said, "Good," in the specific voice he used for things he meant completely, and then he picked her up, which he almost never did because he was not a demonstrative man in public or even in private in the physical sense, and held her for a long moment, and she laughed into his shoulder. "Good," she said. "I've been hoping," he said, which was a great deal for Roy Shelby. The second child arrived in April of 1885. A daughter, this time, born with the same fundamental robustness as her brother and a great deal more immediate and clearly expressed opinion about the world. Dr. Hart, who had now attended both Shelby births, delivered her efficiently and then stood back and said, "Well, this one's going to run things." Roy held her in the first minutes in the way he had held James, with careful, enormous attention, as if she were the most extraordinary object he had ever been permitted to hold, which she was. "What are we naming her?" he asked Edna. Edna was tired in the profound, accomplished way of a woman who has just done something significant and knows it. "Alice," she said. She had been certain of the name for 2 months. Alice Margaret Shelby. For her mother, who deserved the honor and would receive it with the same brisk deflection she used for all sentiment. "Alice," Roy said to his daughter. "Hello," Alice responded by making a very small and extremely decisive sound. "She takes after you," Roy said. "She has your stubbornness," Edna replied. "We'll argue about this later," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice though she was too tired to look. "We will," she agreed and closed her eyes. The letter she wrote to her mother about Alice's birth and name produced a response that arrived in 3 weeks and began, for the first time in the history of Margaret Barrett's correspondence, with the word "wonderful," which was all by itself an event of considerable magnitude. By the summer of 1885, Dry Creek had become something different from what it had been when Edna stepped off the stage 2.5 years earlier. The railroad had made it a node in a larger network rather than a point at the end of one, and that change of position in the geography of commerce and movement had made the town more permanent feeling, more invested in its own continuity. There were plans for a proper school building to replace the limestone box, which Edna was deeply involved in designing, having opinions about natural light and ventilation, and the appropriate height of chalkboards that the school board was learning to take seriously. The church had expanded. The hotel had been renovated. There was a proper telegraph office now, separate from the post office, which meant news from the wider world arrived faster, which was not always comfortable but was, Edna believed, always better than the alternative. She stood in the expanded school building that September, 4 proper rooms, good windows, the chalkboards at the right height, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing made well for a purpose that mattered. She had 31 students now, the oldest class handled by the assistant teacher she had finally persuaded the board to hire, a young woman named Frances Cody from Austin who was capable and earnest, and who found the frontier considerably more challenging than she had anticipated, but was managing with growing conviction. Roy came to find her on the first day of the new school's operation. He came at 4:30 when the last child had gone home, and stood in the doorway of the main classroom and looked around at it, the windows, the light, the rows of proper desks, and then at her, erasing the day's work from the chalkboard with the satisfied air of a person who has done a good day's thing. "Well," she said. "It's good," he said. He said it the way he said things he meant fully. "Did you see the windows?" she said. "They face east-southeast. The light in the morning is, I saw the windows," he said. "The chalkboard height," she said. "I argued for 6 months about that." "I know you did," he said. He was smiling. And it's right," he said. "It's exactly right." She set down the eraser. "How are the children?" "James is refusing to eat anything that Antonio has not personally approved," Roy said. "I'm not sure when Antonio became the authority on edible objects, but apparently it happened. And Alice said something this morning that sounded very much like no, and she said it to the cat, and the cat left the room immediately, so I believe she's going to be fine." Edna laughed. She came across the room to him, and he met her in the doorway, and they stood there together in the last of the afternoon light coming through the east-southeast windows she had fought for. And she looked at this man, her husband, stubborn and capable and honest, the one who fixed broken steps and repaired fences and rebuilt barns, and held her through the terrifying and the wonderful with the same steady hands. And she thought that of all the things she had done in 29, now 30 years, walking through the doors of that stagecoach into the red dust of Dry Creek, Texas, was the one that had cost her the most courage and given her the most back. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They rode back to the 40 acres, 60 acres in the wagon together, James between them on the seat, Alice in the cradle behind, secured with careful rope because Roy took no chances with the road. The evening was September soft, and the light was the color of the stone on the ridge, and the cattle were there in the east pasture, and Antonio and Louis and George were finishing up the evening work, and the limestone house sat solid and warm against the darkening plateau. James climbed down from the wagon before it had properly stopped and ran toward the house with the unstoppable energy of a 2.5-year-old, and Roy called after him in the steady, non-alarmed voice of a man who has learned the particular velocity of toddlers and accounts for it. Alice was awake in the cradle and looked up at the darkening sky with the expression of a 5-month-old confronting the concept of outdoors. Edna lifted Alice and held her against her chest and stood for a moment beside the wagon, looking at the property. The barn that Roy had rebuilt, the house that had grown, the fence lines running straight and true to the east, the creek audible beyond the pasture. The life that was here, actual and present and real. Roy came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her, careful of Alice, who was beginning to consider the option of sleep. "Tell me something," she said. "About what?" "About the next 10 years," she said. "Tell me what you see." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land the way he sometimes did, with that patient, focused attention that was not dreaming but planning, the particular vision of a man who knows the difference between what is and what can be made. "More cattle," he said. "Another room on the house, we'll need it. The railroad will keep bringing people, and some of them will want land, and some of that land should be this. I want to finish the north fence and start using that pasture properly." He paused. "I want James to know this place the way I know it, to understand it, to decide himself someday whether he wants it." "And Alice," Edna said. "Alice," he said, "is going to do whatever she decides to do, and it will be correct, and anyone who argues with her will lose." "That's exactly right," Edna said. "And you," he said. He turned to look at her. "What do you see?" She thought about it. The school building with its east-southeast light. The 31 students who were learning things that would carry them through a world changing faster than any of them could fully map. Frances Cody, finding her footing. The letters to and from her mother, growing longer and warmer. This property, this land, this house built from limestone and intention. "More of this," she said simply. "More of exactly this." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has asked a question. he already knew the answer to and is glad to have it confirmed. Alice made a small, settled sound against Edna's shoulder and went to sleep. James, from inside the house, was heard to say something emphatic to the cat, in a tone that suggested he had learned it from his sister. Roy smiled and Edna smiled, and they went inside together to the lamplit rooms, and the supper that wanted making and the life they had built that was solid and ongoing and entirely, irrevocably theirs. Years later, when James was grown and Alice was nearly so, when the ranch had expanded again, and the school had a third room and Dry Creek had become a proper town with a newspaper and a bank and 2 churches instead of 1, Edna Barrett Shelby sat on the porch of the limestone house in the long summer evening and watched her husband come in from the east pasture the same way she had watched him come in 100 times before, and she felt the same thing she had felt the first time. She felt certain. Roy came through the gate and across the yard and up the steps and sat down beside her in the other porch chair, and he was older now, lines around his eyes, gray beginning in his hair, and she thought that his face had only become more itself with time, more fully the face of Roy Shelby, which was still the most honest face she knew. "Long day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. The distinction, for Roy, was important and intentional. She reached over and took his hand. He held hers with the same firmness he always had, the hand of a man who understood that holding on was an active thing, not a passive one. The evening came in warm and enormous over the plateau, and the creek said its constant thing over its stones, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the limestone house sat solid against the darkening sky, full of the accumulated weight of everything they had chosen and built and kept. This was the thing she had come to Dry Creek to find, even though she had not known its shape when she was looking for it. This man, this place, this life that was hard and real, and full of the specific beautiful difficulty of things that matter. She had arrived with 2 carpet bags and a broken heart and a teaching certificate, and she had found, in the red dust and the open sky of the Edwards Plateau, something that Cincinnati and all its expectations had not been able to offer her. She had found a life that was entirely her own, and she had found the man who was building it beside her, board by board and fence line by fence line and year by honest year, until the thing they had made together was something neither of them could have built alone. Roy turned and looked at her in the last of the light, and she looked back at him, and everything that needed to be said between them had already been said, and would go on being said every day in the simple language of people who have chosen each other and kept choosing. And the evening closed around the limestone house on the 60 acres on the edge of the Edwards Plateau in Dry Creek, Texas, in the fullness of a life that was good and real and exactly enough.